All right, you guys should get that update soon. So housekeeping item, just to get it out the way, I want to have a quick confirmation and discussion on how folks want to handle next Friday. So I think next Friday is a holiday, or at least a holiday for some folks. It would be a governance session on our like our call schedule, but we have in kind of the most recent governance stream calls that we've been doing have been going through the community issue log as well, so that we're kind of going through a process around identifying things that may actually not be apt for profiling changes, but we have to be able to kind of assess whether or not they're community issue items that have to be passed along to kind of other parties or like passed back to the general community, as opposed to kind of making decisions that might be out of scope. So I'm gonna just make a call. Like, are there folks that would not be comfortable with us canceling next Friday, which is let me just confirm.
10th. It should be the 10th.
Yep. Yeah.
The only question I have is that is there anything that we need to discuss either from this group or the governance group before partnership starts the following week?
That's a good point. I think one of our only outstanding kind of discussion items that we've been having, like that we had in flight, was around how should we be handling like extensions that are referenced from other guides, but that's not so much a partnership call. So I'll put it up to the floor. Like, are there items that we would want to make sure we touch on from like a more governance perspective before partnership the week of the 13th?
I personally don't know already, but I thought I should just ask the question.
Yep. What about, because partnership is the week of I'm just putting 2 and 2 together because it's the week of the 13th. I had anticipated we would have our profiling call on the 17th, but would that be challenging for folks that are going? Would anyone be opposed to us having that call on the 17th?
Yeah, I suspect for most people, okay, I'm going to be in the air heading to US Thanksgiving.
Got it. Okay. What about others? Would folks be joining on the 17th for a profiling call? Basically a continuation of working through our issue log, making decisions, and effectively like actually applying the changes.
I don't think there's anything urgent. If folks need to attend partnership and not have a call.
Well, partnership is done. I'm coming home from partnership on the 16th. I don't know about other people's travel schedules.
Are there folks going to partnership folks who are online? Okay.
I won't be going. I know that.
Sorry.
And Neil, I won't be going.
Okay. So I think, given that's profiling, I'm kind of, what I would like to probably do is keep the session on the 17th for profiling, and potentially that would mean the next time we meet on governance would be the 24th. But like, for context, especially for folks who are kind of new joiners, like our goal right now is to try to get through all of our kind of outstanding issues and get through what kind of sits between us and being able to be like a leverageable set of artifacts that folks are comfortable with for kind of the next 6 months or so, where it's like we're able to be potentially used by the CA Core. We've got all of these things that have been sitting in our issue log for a while, resolved in some manner. So the reason I'm pitching the 17th as still having that meeting is because I don't want to lose momentum. We're getting actually closer, which is another topic item that we're going to discuss today. But like, I think, you know, folks, let us know if you're not comfortable with it. Otherwise, what I'll follow up with Mike and kind of just chat about canceling the one for next week and then continuing on the 17th and keeping up our current sequencing and schedule. All right. Okay. So in terms of, I think I'll call it housekeeping, but sorry, go ahead.
What did you say?
Oh, sorry, that might just be some background noise, Anil, on yours. Okay, so in terms of housekeeping and process-wise, one of the things that we've been talking about recently in our kind of push for more collaboration when it comes to editing is actually going through, as we go through these issues, you know, kind of assigning who's comfortable with making those changes and actually kind of capturing updates on where we sit, right? Because sometimes in the past, as we have kind of worked through changes, we throw that in our issue log and we'll update the status. But like if you're not subscribed to you know, a particular profile or to our project, you're not always getting kind of those updates. So I want to start with kind of first things first, a look at what our issue log looks like today, and to let folks know kind of how they can effectively subscribe to the project and to individual issues, and to, I think you can subscribe to the profile as well. Maybe not, maybe just the issues. But effectively, like when I have subscribed to the project as a whole, right, the CA baseline, what that effectively means is that when I have a change to our profile files, right, our structure definitions that come from GitHub, I get an email that says, you're subscribed to the CA baseline. Here's what's changed in the last week. And I think the subscription mechanism for other folks who are on, let me know. But I think that you're usually, if you haven't subscribed already, prompted here. You might be prompted. Is that what other folks are seeing? You've got like a little subscribe option as opposed to just seeing the generic, this is how many people have subscribed. I'll put in the chat for folks that want to pull it up on their own that haven't. Has anyone not subscribed on the call to the project for updates to the files?
Mine says subscription 10.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm not subscribed.
Okay. So one of the nice things about doing that, and I wish maybe if I logged out, I might be able to actually see this, is that it counts for, because essentially our project is constantly in sync with our GitHub repository. And so as part of kind of a communally developed product, we're able to actually kind of keep up to date with the things that are kind of lagging and the things that might have those impacts to our actual projects themselves. I might have to be logged in to see the subscription. I know it's possible to do. I just don't know what it looks like for someone that hasn't subscribed in the past. So maybe I'll come back to this. But if, for instance, you are a submitter of a ticket, I think you're automatically subscribed to any changes in like the updates to the tickets themselves. So I've got our issue log right now where we're tracking current open and closed tickets in the past. I'm going to put that in the chat. So that's like all of our potential tickets. So I'm not filtering by status right now. If you are, for instance, let's pull up an open one real quick. So say you're Ken and you've submitted a ticket, one of the ones that we're going to look at today. Typically what happens is I think you'll be automatically subscribed. So when we comment or we indicate, you know, the change has been approved and it's being applied by this particular member, and then after we comment and indicate that it has been applied, Ken will get an update from his email. So he's not having to check the issue log continuously. If it's an issue that you are particularly interested in, the other thing that you can do for that particular issue is you can click subscribe, and that will set up the system where if you're logged in, you've got an account in Simplifier, you will see any updates week to week.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to have an account in order to submit a ticket.
Yep.
Question. So this one's submitted by Ken, correct?
Yep.
Do we, if we're going to talk about it today, do we let him know that we're going to talk about it today?
I think in the ones where I've done some like pre-triaging. There are ones where if we have like an ask for clarity or we need like further delve in, it absolutely makes sense to try to get the ask from the original submitter. I've done a little bit of prep work ahead of time for this one, and I think we can talk through it. But if we determine we can't make a decision without, like, if we come across a follow-up conversation with Ken, then the way we've handled it in the past is, we'll indicate this is what we need further clarity on, and kind of execute that ask Ken either asynchronously or on the next call.
Okay.
So let's try it today. We might find out, hey, we can't get to this on our own. But typically, on the calls where we are reviewing the issue logs, like we have a good sense of like what's something that may need further follow-up. And sometimes we'll uncover that ourselves where we're just pulling things off of for instance, the open list. Because sometimes it's really hard. Like a lot of times we have, especially with where our issue log is right now, like we have things that are years old, and some things do require further feedback, and some things are just, we haven't had the capacity to actually make those changes. So is part of our kind of new process for trying to actually give folks who are kind of called in today updates on where we're sitting. We had been kind of working through some of the established ready for application changes, as well as some of the ones that we've discussed in the last 2 weeks of profiling. So updates are big thanks to Arthur None. I don't think he's on the call right now, but he raised his hand as an editor in the last couple of weeks, and he's been able to kind of help us work through, a particular kind of set of tickets that have been sitting in our log for a while now. So those have been QA'd, we've got them merged in. They're actually present on essentially our CA baseline CI build, right? So the changes actually that are present here, as well as they've been synced into our project repository. So what that means is effectively, if you've been looking at the baseline for the last few months and you've been thinking, oh man, I don't understand why that, let me just pull up one of these examples. Why, I think this is a practitioner role one. Why this extension still has this this lack of change that we agreed 2 months ago. By getting community editors and getting these changes in, you're now going to actually see this in the project itself. We haven't packaged yet, but you're at least able to kind of start to see progress on these changes and the closure of kind of outstanding issues. So for those that are kind of like that keep an eye on the project schedule or want to know about like the specific profiles that have been changed, the ones that we've gotten updated since, I think it was in the last week and a half, are this one, and this one. I put it in the chat. So we're working through it, which is great. It's exactly what we wanted. And there are ones that we can still continue kind of putting in the hopper for our collaborative editors to start working their way through. So there's 2 I want to just knock right off the bat because they should be super simple. I think we can make a decision on them. I think we can get them in the hopper and get them made. And then there's a handful of other ones that I think merit both kind of further discussion on, as well as we can go through the actual application. So actually, I'll pause for a second. Any questions on those tickets or like the process of kind of doing these updates on where we sit with assigned, like people who have kind of assigned tickets to them? Okay, the only thing I'll do, and being completely honest, is I have a ticket assigned to me for diagnostic report effective that hasn't been pushed yet. Change has been made, but we're hopefully returning to diagnostic report effective today for a different constraint that we're evaluating. So I haven't pushed that up yet. So that's my accountability call out. Okay. So for folks who are following along in the chat, there are 2 tickets I want to just get right off the bat. So 2481 and 2482. They're both typo tickets, which is why I thought, let's just confirm we're good to apply those changes and we'll just review it together. And it's there too. Beautiful. Okay.
So a question around typos.
Yep.
HL7 International no longer votes on typos. They just let the editors fix them. Do you think our process should be similar, or do we need to look at the typos? Now, sometimes an editor will look at what's identified as a typo and it's not really a typo and it needs discussion. But I wonder if we can't leave that to the discretion of the editors.
So I thought that at first, but then I thought about what we talked about. What was that, Elliot? Like 2 weeks ago, about trying to actually make call outs on calls to say who's available to make this change. And I think
that's
yeah.
the good that's the reason to bring them up.
Yeah. And so prepare yourselves, folks, because I'm going to probably make that ask. That's the end goal here, which is, you know, at least while we start kind of trying to execute against this process and trying to get more editors, there might be a few like this that are like easy to raise your hands for, but we will ask for help on.
Awesome.
So
that's an excellent reason.
Yeah. So once we get it going, I'm hoping like people will just be able to go right to the ready for application bucket. But at least when we're starting off. So we've got two that are somewhat recent on extensions, and they are typographical issues. Let's just take a look at them. And then for folks who are interested in contributing to the baseline and doing some editing, I'll make that ask in a second here. Essentially, within this extension definition that we have identified here for service language, there is a typo on the actual description of the extension. So when we look at the description, I'm just going to pull up JSON. And the description is an element that is on the extension itself. So it's not actually like falling within the differential. So what Richard is calling out is just that we've got a duplicate that here. Seems truly typographical, should be a very fast and simple fix for folks. And so I'm going to call back this ask. Is there anyone who would help us make a quick extension structure definition change to that description element to remove the duplicate that? Is the concern like timing for folks? Sorry, go ahead, Elliot.
I was going to say I'll jump in if no one else will.
Going once. So other call out. I think we probably should have a credits page. So Elliot, obviously you're already on the credits page because you've done quite a lot of editing for us already. But if anyone is looking to maybe raise their name up as contributing to Canadian Guides in a really simple way, I feel like an auctioneer, but this is a really easy way of doing that. So I'll make the call out once more. Is anyone interested outside of Elliot in making the change to the description?
Yeah, this is Piers. I mean, I'm happy to help
Awesome.
out. Haven't joined this call for a while, and I might need a bit of guidance on how to actually make the change, but it's probably a good time to learn anyways.
Okay. So why don't we've got two here, Piers. That is excellent. Why don't I add you as a responsible editor for this one? We've got another very similar one. We'll walk through it on the call. It'll be recorded. And then you'll have that, like, we're always available for questions if you have them. And we are reviewing the requests that come through, but it's a good way to kind of walk through the process that we're doing for our editors. So
Exactly. Thanks.
yeah, thanks for volunteering. So I'm going to put responsible editor, Piers. And we will walk through so we're confirmed the change is going to be made. I'll comment on this. I'm going to make it ready for application. And I will walk you guys now through with the second one, 2482. It's not in description, but it's an update to title. So for this one, it's another extension, individuals deceased. And what Richard is just pointing out is that like there is a typographical issue on the title where individual is capitalized. So we'll go and actually look at this in the JSON, and then we're going to make that change. So just like the structure definition, we looked at description here a second ago, title is here. So what Richard's asking for is, can we just make that quick capitalization of individual to follow a more consistent kind of typographical convention that we've had in the past? Anyone oppose? This is not a formal vote, but like, you know, it's a minor edit to us going forward and just making that edit on the call. All right, I will be applied. I'll put myself as a responsible editor. And we'll go through the motions together. So there's number to be applied. I have pulled up our GitHub repository, and peers, I'll get you added onto that. And if anyone else wants to raise their hand, we can get them added as a contributor as well. Within our GitHub repository, we have, like when you go for the first time to CA baseline, you're going to see our master branch. And so our master branch has basically, this is the QA'd content that represents what gets into our CI build of the pages, as well as the Canadian project within the Canadian FHIR registry. So when I go to make a change, or when any other editors go to make a change, the process that we're going to follow is we are going to create a new branch for a particular change, right? Because sometimes we only have 5 minutes between meetings to make a change, and we aren't like trying to make a huge kind of lift on folks to have their own branches that are outside of like a commit here or a commit there. So I'm going to create a branch for my commit. So I'm going to name my branch, which one did I say I was going to do? 2482. That just helps me track the issue that I'm particularly like I'm responsible for editing. It's already set to kind of branch from the master. So all of the most recent QA updates are there. I will create that new branch. And I'm going to actually click on 2482. I'm sure there's another faster way of getting about this, but this is how I do it. So I have a GitHub desktop client. When I want to make the edit, you can edit within, you know, your branch itself. If you've got a really simple change and you just want to go to your input file and you want to go, for instance, to your extension definition under resources. I think the one I had was 2482 on individual deceased. Oh, look, it's right here for us. So you could make the edit just directly here. As folks are getting more comfortable with the process, I typically recommend getting set up so that you can actually run this in your, like through GitHub locally and doing your validation, particularly if you're making like a change in the profiles, but throwing it out there that it's just as possible to make typographical edits in this interface. So I'm going to show you it the way that I typically do it, which is I got my branch and I'm going to open it up on my computer. So 2482, I'm going to open with GitHub Desktop. It's going to prompt me. I'm in the branch. I'm in another branch right now. But let's say I was on the master. I'm just going to leave my changes. It's going to prompt me to have to fetch the origin in order to recognize that there's a new branch available for me to work on. I don't know why it's taking so long, because there's nothing that's different except that branch. And now I'm just going to go 2442 or no, 2482. Yep, 2482. All right, so I'm here. I'm in the interface that can tell me what I've changed in my particular branch. I'm going to open it up in my Explorer. So this is essentially the CA baseline, and this is for this particular branch, like what is loaded for it right now. I'm going to go to my input folder. That's where all of our changes occur, whether they're page changes or whether they're resource changes, whether they're, you know, like updating images in the guide. It all lives under input. And then I'm going to go to resources, because what actually Richard is being asked to change is, it's not a page, it's an extension, which is a structure definition. And I know which one to find because I'm using the naming convention here. Structure definition, EXT, meaning it's an extension, not a profile. And I'm looking for deceased. So let's take a look where deceased is in this. Here it is. So structure definition, extension, deceased. I'm going to open it in my editor of choice. I'm going to make the change. I'm going to save the change. Now, it's always best practice to run your program if you have IG Publisher set up, particularly if you're making like an actual, like, let's say I changed the data type of this extension, or I changed a cardinality, or I changed maybe even like in a profile, maybe I changed value set binding or slicing. When you open it and run it locally after you've saved the change, what that allows for you to do if you're utilizing IG Publisher is to confirm, like, I didn't introduce an error somewhere, it's rendering the way I think it should. And that becomes increasingly more important as we do more sophisticated things. With typographical errors, I'm just going to show you what this looks like to go through the GitHub process. But should you desire in the future to kind of work on some of those more like, you know, change a binding, change a must support, remove a section, that kind of thing, your step would always be to essentially just run the actual file for creating the local version of the guide to just confirm the QA process goes through. But because I want to make sure we get to the other things today, I want to show you what happens after I click save on that file that I was just in JSON. So I'm just got my GitHub interface, you know, the client up. You can see in my changes, I'm looking at this branch still, and it's saying I've made this change to this branch. Looks good. It's what I wanted to do. So what I'm going to do is actually just commit that change. So I'm going to say number 2482. I put things in, you certainly don't have to. Typographical correction. I'm going to commit that. I'm going to push it because it's really nice to just check that box and commit and try to get your pull request in for a really simple change. And then as a, like, let's say I'm Elliot and I'm reviewing a change. When Elliot goes now to, actually, hold on, let me walk that back for a second. So what I've done is I've committed the change that I made. I have pushed it up to the branch, meaning I've done something locally, and now I've made it actually sync on the branch on GitHub. And the last step I'm going to do as an editor for this is I'm going to refresh my GitHub. I'm going to see that I have made a recent push, and I'm going to submit a pull request. So my pull request is just going to pull in whatever my commit comment was. I'm going to create it. Basically what it is it's putting a pull request by default from your branch into the master. And the way we've set it up right now is that what it means is now it requires a secondary review that is distinct from like the original requester. So I've done what I need to as an editor at this point. If you're coming in as, let's say, Elliot or peers in the future, or Arthur is going in as a reviewer, really all that we are doing when we are looking at it from our side is we're looking at the files that have changed. Depending on how complex the commit is, we're pulling down that branch and we're running it and making sure everything is looking good. It's running correctly. The change is what was described in the issue, in our issue log. We're reviewing it and we're approving it. And as soon as it gets approved, that branch gets like melded into the master, meaning it now shows up on the World Wide Web and it shows up in our project, and it's a change that our community members can now see have actually gone through. So
Sheridan, do you want to pass sharing over to me and I'll do a review?
hopefully you won't find too many issues. All right. Thanks, Elliot.
All right, so you can see, yeah, right thing. So I will go in, see that there's a pull request. Sheridan made a change. What was her change? Yeah, looks good. If it didn't, I could add a comment. Sheridan wouldn't be able to check it in until that had been addressed, or wouldn't be able to merge it. But we'll do this. Okay. And now I've approved it. Sheridan, you want it back to merge, or do you want me to do the merge?
Nope. So how I've been doing it on other editors is I just merge in the pull request so that and I like update the ticket. So if you want to just merge that yeah, if you can put in the pull request and then close the branch, we should be good. And then we'll delete the branch. That way that like we aren't carrying a bunch of kind of historical components that have already been weaved in. Beautiful. Okay, so then in the next minute or two, if you were to go to CA baseline deceased, let me actually get that for you folks. I'll share it on my end. It's probably, so usually you can't tell right away because they're like, if you are using, for instance, the, if you're using the build.fhir.org version to determine if your change goes through, typically takes a couple minutes to actually go through. But if anyone wants to check our work in about 3 minutes, you should see a title change here. I'll put it in the chat. So this might seem silly to do for like to walk you guys through this process in this extent, but we want to do it for really 2 reasons. One, it makes it easier so that if you want to raise your hand, you kind of know what the steps are. And 2, realistically, the more we develop FHIR capacity, which is a true goal of this work, we will, on our own teams, in our own institutions, in our own jurisdictions, want to have collaborative editing of our own projects. You may work on a team of a few folks or even more, but these are practices where if you learn them now in these types of communities, you can bring them into your own, and you're that much more well-equipped to start to make your own FHIR profiles and manage your guides and manage changes over time. So, you know, that's the reason we try to kind of record these items and make them available, just to lower that barrier. But if there's ever a question or there's ever a concern about like, what if I mess it up? Like part of this is about building confidence that you've got people who are going to be reviewing this, and that like the most important thing is just to try, because that is the purpose of this group, is to communally develop these and build our capabilities in FHIR. So
Well, and using GitHub means any change can always be rolled back to a previous version.
yes, yeah. So there's like, don't be afraid. And like I said earlier, like our goal, I think, once we start tackling a lot more of these issues, I think one of the things that we should probably add in is a credits page to thank all the people who have kind of helped us get to the point that we are, like through the development initially of the profiles and the actual kind of meeting to make decisions, as well as all of the folks who have kind of helped us edit and make changes along the way. So I'm going to go back to this just to completely do this kind of end to end. Me, as if I was reviewing this, if I was in Elliot's position, what I've done in the past is I'll just go through and I'll say like 11.3, change has been made. And I'll comment and I'll just close it out. And now we have one less thing closed with change. That
And I know you've probably gone through this before. Now that we've made it in GitHub and it's ended up in the CI build, how does it get to Simplifier?
So the way it's set up in Simplifier is, let me just actually see if we'll get that changed now. I think sometimes it can take a few minutes as well, but we have, hold on, where is it?
Yeah, I'm watching Zulip. It's not CI build isn't complete yet.
It hasn't hit it yet. Okay. I think there is still a delay though between when, even if like we write it into GitHub, so that master branch, we've set up a integration between, or a linkage between our project repository and GitHub. So I'll show you what that actually looks like from our settings perspective. So we did some work ahead of time to actually link the repository, and I'm not going to click unlink, but it will tell you like what's the what is the URL of the GitHub repository that you want to sync with. And once you have identified that, you apply settings that say, here's what I want you to pull over. And this is kind of important sometimes, especially if you are, for instance, not managing your guidance simplifier, or there are, you probably noticed in GitHub, there are a number of files that aren't like this input cache and the template and all of these like, you know, batch files that are around how do you run IG Publisher. They don't really matter in Simplifier because our goal of the project in Simplifier is just host the files for the resources, right? For the structure definitions, for our profiles and extensions. So what we've done is we've written using the syntax in Simplifier, basically statements that say, this is what I want you to include. I want you to include the things that we're pulling from this folder and the things that end in JSON and XML. And from that, I want you to exclude anything that has an image, a .cs, or anything in the examples folder. So what we're saying is like, we've got this kind of like input folder. Don't pull over anything that's here. Right now, there's just ignore text, but you know, if we did have examples, they'd also be filtered. So that setting determines, where was I? Like what actually ends up getting pulled through. And it's what allows for when there is that, I guess it's maybe like a polling that occurs between the parent repository and the project to know exactly what to pull down. So I actually noticed it last week. I think I accidentally pulled down a page that I was updating, and it got pulled down into Simplifier as well. So we may have to edit those settings a little bit. But what that should mean is that, let's see if we can, maybe it's come through already.
Yep.
So not yet. We can see the one that came in from last week, but the actual sync from GitHub to Simplifier hasn't happened quite yet. So sometimes there can be.
Well, you also don't have extensions marked there in your filter.
Oh, interesting. I didn't catch that the first time around. I thought they were coming through. We didn't.
No, I mean in your display, I meant. Yeah, there.
Oh, got it. There we go. Good call out, Lorraine. So it was just looking at, I think, profiles then, not extensions. So looks good. All synced up, nice and easy. So that's like a, you know, the 15-minute how we've set up this and how you might consider this on your own, because some of the other benefits to doing like having a GitHub repository is that like oftentimes we're managing what we want to put out for new releases or new features in addition to like a CI build or in addition to a stable release. And so sometimes if you're working with your development teams and you want to have more than just, you know, one set of profiles that every time you make an update makes an update in your project, this could be helpful for you. So I'm going to go back to our issue log real quick, because we've kind of given you that idea. And Elliot, I think in the chat, you also showed how somebody can take a look using Zulip to notice like whether or not their build that they just did has succeeded or failed. Thank you for putting that in there. I want to talk about diagnostic report because I have a change that's sitting on one of my branches that I've been wanting to put in that we started 2 weeks ago. So we effectively had been looking at diagnostic report, our general profile, and we'd been noticing that there were a couple issues that had been raised by the community around expectations for effective. Notably, you know, it was pretty strict. It had like a 1-to-1 and a must support. And we were hearing that there were use cases and profiles that weren't requiring this minimum cardinality of 1 on the generic kind of diagnostic report for results profile. So we made the decision last profiling call to remove the cardinality. And I've got that partially applied. But then when we were talking about it, we also said, well, based on what we're hearing, does it make sense to also keep the must support on effective as well? Because I think what we had heard was that there are some systems that really like, they just aren't expecting effective date. They care about specimen date. And so to have a must support or a cardinality or even invariant constraint might not make sense for them. And so we looked at, should we remove the must support as well? So what we've done to date is we talked a little bit about what the impact would be to legacy data to keeping the must support on effective, even if it's optional. And we said, okay, well, with CCDA, you know, we think that like the element would exist, but we're not sure like how frequently or how effectively systems are using it. We talked about, you know, maybe looking at it from the V2 perspective, because we really didn't, other than I think Rita had joined and talked a little bit about OLIS, we didn't have other examples from the Canadian perspective of like, are there cases where you just don't need this? And so the other just component for framing that we put in is that we looked at US Core, and US Core actually does put in some degree of constraints. It's optional, but it also has some conditional requirements where, you know, a large number of statuses tied to the diagnostic result will have an impact about whether or not they expect effective. So what that is basically saying is that US systems assume that the use cases that they are tackling in FHIR, particularly under US Core, will have to support effective in a number of cases. And so what go ahead, Lorraine.
But the US Core, of course, one of the big differences in the US environment press around result reporting is that meaningful use requires LRI in V2. So, which is much stricter profile in V2 than a lot of our labs apply. I was just going to go see if I can bring up an existing V2 result report while you're talking.
Yep.
Yep.
So the LRI stands for, what was it, Lorraine?
Lab results. I forget the interface. Something. It's the lab results reporting for meaningful use in the US for V2.
Straight from its meaningful.
Okay, let me bring up
That.
Okay, I'm just going to put you back on mute.
Yep. I will just finish up the note. And then while we're basically looking at that piece, I think what we have to basically acknowledge is that there's some legacy data where this isn't available. So we may not have, you know, that core rationale for keeping the cardinality tight or even having an invariant in place. What I'd like you folks to think about is, do we have a reason for keeping must support on effective? If we remove the cardinality and keep it optional, like, are there downstream impacts to what you'd like to see kind of consistently represented? And or the other way of talking about this is, do you have a profile today that really doesn't need diagnostic report effective, and therefore it does, like, you would argue in the other way? Because I think that's really what we want to get down to, which is, like, from our community perspective, we have a lot of evidence to say that there's good reason why we're not seeing it consistently, but I think we have to make a decision on whether or not we keep it, because we have a good reason to keep the must support on effective here. Legacy data in EV2. Stricter interpretation in US core. Then our Canadian lab data has currently. So does anyone have an argument for why we should maintain our must support in this case? If we've identified an implementer that doesn't utilize effective diagnostic report .effective for their profile, the downside is keeping must support has kind of an unintended consequence of promoting that people who don't need it have to support it in some way, right? If they want to be kind of in alignment with the CA baselines rules, they would be expected to have a must support here as well, unless we remove it or have a really good reason for keeping it.
Hopefully my stuff works, but the intention I've always looked at with these must supports is kind of like it should be recommended thing, that we would expect it to be there under most circumstances, but it's not always there, so that's why it's not mandatory.
That's not the definition of must support, though. It means you have to write code around it.
It means you have to support it if it shows up. And that's
Yes.
where it comes back to our definitions of what does must support really mean.
Yeah, it means you have to do whatever the implementation guide says you have to do with must support.
That's true. That is true.
Right. And that's where I went back to our definitions. Like we made a bunch of changes to our definitions of what must support really means because of those kind of issues.
So for folks who are interested, so it's hard to write a clear-cut must support definition in a guide for like a base, and sometimes even for a core, but more so from a base. And we knew that if we were trying to promote behaviors in our Canadian ecosystem using our base, that we had to have a definition of what it looks like for a server and a client in a create and query scenario for must support, but acknowledge that if anyone would ever like derive or impose from the baseline profiles, that it creates challenges in that sometimes often a downstream implementation guide has a much stricter definition. You might be, like in Lorraine's case, you write code for it. It might be you demonstrate it at a testing event. It might be you display it to a user in an interface. And so we've been very careful with where we've applied it. And actually, Randy, to your point, like I was wondering if maybe we should phrase it as like a should support, which is something that we call out in our narrative, is like, hey, this is a best practice, even though we can't apply the must support given challenges with it not being consistently used in some of the existing FHIR implementations today. So that's another option that we can discuss.
Well, that's kind of that flip-flop point of how strong do you want to suggest that it should be there? So like when you leave it as must support, you really say, we really expect the normal process would use this. Whereas your recommend or your should support says not quite as strongly. So, yeah.
So what do folks
Do we
think?
anticipate maybe moving to obligations instead of must support?
We've talked
Kind of
about,
work together.
yeah. And we've gone through that review in the past, Joni, of like how, like for the ones that we're keeping as must support, what are the obligations that we'd apply to them? But I
Okay.
think like anything that we mark as should support now, I think would probably be a target in the future for a potential obligation. Because Randy's right, they do work together. If you've got a must support and an obligation defined, both, the obligation applies to the must support, but you can also have an obligation without it. So we could apply that to things that are should support.
Yeah, I mean, like we could do something where anything that has must support, we also define obligations, and it's really clear what must support means.
Yeah, so I'm actually looking at the 282 definitions of the segments right now. And one of the challenges, of course, is the definition of effective time relative to the other times in a report, because the physiologically relevant time is the specimen collection date time. I'm looking at 282. Neither ORC or OBR have a something they call effective time. There's the date time of the transaction in ORC, and there's the date, time, and time range of the observation in OBR. And of course, individual observations have their own time range, but we're talking about diagnostic report, not the individual observations. So in the reality that in this business space, most of our current communication is V2. I think we got to be careful about mandating things that aren't in our existing systems.
So the argument you're making is that like if you are doing a transformation between V2 use of diagnostic reporting and FHIR, that it's likely that you won't have a direct tie-in between diagnostic report and effective. You would more likely see that on specimen.
Yes. I mean, there's other date times, but the question is, what do you actually map to effective time? And frankly, I'm looking at 282. I'm seeing 2.3 and 2.4 things running around in production in our environments. I don't know what other people see in terms of the lab space, but
is that enough?
now, I haven't gone and looked at the V2 to FHIR mapping work that's supposed to go to ballot this cycle to see what they did, but
does anyone have a let me pose this as like a potential decision point. Given the argument that we have for it's likely in our legacy in our systems that are using V2, that having this constraint would make it more challenging for folks that are doing their mapping because there isn't like a really solid one-to-one mapping that has a good constraint today. Is anyone against making this not must support, but indicating in our usage notes that it is a should support with some context behind what we've talked about?
I have challenges with the should supports anyway, but
Well, I think that we really the challenge is we want to be able to allow these legacy things to go through, but we shouldn't hobble going forward just to support legacy stuff.
well, I don't know what we really mean by effective time on a diagnostic.
Well, I'm not worried about this specific case
Mhm.
here. I'm just thinking
Yeah.
in general, if we shouldn't use that it's a legacy restriction that we remove something for. It's if we don't see a use for something going forward, not because of legacy, but because we don't use it, that's a different case, right? But if it's the case that the legacy system doesn't support something, that doesn't really mean we shouldn't have it as a must support going forward. It means that legacy system is going to have a challenge filling that field in. But going forward, you should try to fill it, right?
But going forward, if one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves if the legacy systems don't have it, have we clearly identified the business need for that element, which is what would drive us into a should or a shall, right?
I'm gonna pause there.
Um,
I've got a question. I'm gonna assume that we probably won't be able to make a decision because Elliot, I see that you've got, you want to ask for 2 minutes, but I do see Harsh's hand up. So I'm gonna go to Harsh and then,
Yes.
if you want to put in your note, Harsh, and then I'll basically indicate this for probably further discussion at the next session.
Sure. I just have a quick point, and I agree with Lauren, like has to have a business need behind this. And I also agree with Randy because, you know, not everything which is legacy should be transitioned over to the new, but there has to be, this is a perfect example where we need a landscape analysis done throughout the Canadian realm saying, do we really use this element?
Maybe not necessarily do we, but should we?
Yeah, or should we? Yeah, I mean, if it's relevant enough in future.
So is that like something that we should raise for the folks that are doing the framework to say like, hey, like we've looked at our implementations, we're unclear. This is like an item that we think when you're asking folks for feedback, like ask them specifically around these, like, are you using it? Should you be using it? And what is it supposed to reflect?
And do we have a clear business definition of what the element is? Because some of our definitions, particularly some of them that are coming from the base spec, are just awful.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to put it here. We'll come back to this conversation. Elliot, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you 1 minute. You can go over by a minute or two, but you said there was another item that you want to talk about.
Well, I just wanted to ask, since we did the original profiling, the IG publisher has gotten a lot stricter in the things it checks for. And the recommendations on profiling best practices have changed somewhat. So when you run IG publisher on what we've got in GitHub, it's kicking out a whole bunch of errors that weren't there a year ago.
So you're referring to, hold on, let me go to it real quick, like QA report here.
Yeah.
And so what's your ask, Elliot? Will you repeat it?
Well, so should like we just have someone go in, do a cleanup? This isn't changing the intended profiling at all, but it's most of it I suspect is going to be yeah. So the slicing, we need to just update that value.
Yeah.
Other places, yeah, we've got, okay, bad fire path. There was one or a whole bunch I saw. Around slicing. So should we just go in and do one cleanup ticket, or should we file individuals for everyone, or how should this be handled? Or do we say, yeah, we're not going to worry about it?
I don't think we should say we're not going to worry about it. We might want to do a ticket per category, because there'll be some things that'll be much more difficult to deal with, like some of the vocabulary resolutions. But other things that are much more straightforward to address. I mean, and I'd be comfortable with just one ticket too, but I think we may actually want to divide and conquer on this, because it's cleaning this up is a lot of work.
Yeah.
So do you want that as a like one of our items on the next profiling call, which is to say like, hey, can we go through these on grouped items and just get like who's working on what? So we'll finish up the conversation here, the decision about like, do we remove it in the meantime for this, and then go over to like doing the call outs for what are the changes that we want to make now and who's going to make them on these for the session on the 17th. Okay. There's a couple other ones that we can work through, but we'll see how much time we have on the next session.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, folks. Productive session. I'll load the recording up on the YouTube shortly. And thanks just for keeping up the flame and getting this refreshed and improved in the next round of ads that we're doing.